Hey everyone, and welcome to my BNB Glow channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Will, you're not the father. Bridget happily announces the DNA results to Katie and Will. Will, you're not the father. Those 5 words detonated like a loaded line in a powder room, immediate and inevitable, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to 3 faces, Bridget's pale with a kind of fierce compassion she'd rehearsed in secret, Katie's mouth an O of confusion that curdled into dread, and Will's face collapsing through disbelief into a canyon of hurt so raw that everyone nearest him seemed to flinch as if struck. Then, because pain breeds motion, an atmosphere of explosive fighting rose like thunder. Questions hurled without ceremony, accusations thrown like dinner plates, hands pulled back and then flung forward in gestures that were less aimed at restitution than at the need to be heard. The story that unspooled from Bridget's trembling hands was a carefully compiled dossier, lab reports, seals, chain of custody annotations, a doctor's hesitant note, yet what the paper proved could not soften the brutality of its revelation. People who had been certain of their lives were suddenly adrift on evidence, and certainty, once unclasped, cuts like glass. Katie, who had been the picture of maternal stability, became a tempest of voice. How could you keep this from us? Who told you? Why would anyone do this? Her questions were lobbed in the heat of betrayal, toward Bridget for delaying, toward doctors for tampering, toward the world for conspiring. Will, who sat stunned, alternated between the clinical curiosity of a man learning facts and the animal grief of someone whose future had pinballed into a new, unfamiliar terrain. He wanted names, he wanted motives, he wanted the solid facts like stepping stones to hold him upright, but as the room filled with more and more people, family summoned, friends arriving like a flurry of concerned gulls, the fighting expanded into clusters of private skirmishes and public melees. There was yelling and slamming, doors, cabinets, fists on countertops where family photos rattled unwatched. An aunt called someone a liar and was answered in kind by a cousin who produced text messages that contradicted the initial claim. A former ally turned prosecutor in an instant, counting the reasons that this deception, if deception it was, would end marriages and careers, and the words between them became ammunition. The legal possibilities, paternity suits, annulment motions, questions about past decisions made under different assumptions, were brandished like new weapons, and the company lawyers who had learned to speak in hedges began to write memos even as they tried to soothe the immediate emotional chaos, their pens turning the private fight into a public calculus. The media, of course, smelled blood. By afternoon there were already carefully phrased leaks about DNA results and family turmoil, and the camera crews that followed soap families like constellations of gossip hovered at the edges, sensing the moment when private disaster becomes serialized spectacle. In living rooms and boardrooms, conversations doubled back on themselves. Who had accessed the blood samples, which lab had been used, had chain of custody been violated, and more painfully, who had known and remained silent. The quietest, cruelest blows were those that landed without a bang, a remembered look exchanged years ago in an elevator, a late-night promise made and then forgotten, the realization that someone you loved had kept a painful secret under the idea they were protecting you. Those were the long knives that slipped into the ribs where forgiveness had not yet grown callous. As accusations mounted, alliances hardened. People who had been cordial neighbors now stood in camps, those who argued that the DNA evidence was a clerical error and that Will's paternity was still the simplest explanation, and those who insisted on the sanctity of the scientific method and the need for immediate, legally supervised retesting. There was an ugly sort of factionalism to it all. Friends lost their temper and their common sense, citing old grievances as if this new wound legitimized every prior slight. The fighting took on the rhythm of a chorus, someone shouted, then a rebuttal, then a personal memory unspooled into a litany of proof that did nothing to settle the matter but everything to deepen the hurt. A scene that might have been contained became a cascade, a slapped hand, a chair overturned as if the furniture itself wanted to make a break for safety, a family heirloom knocked from a mantel and cracked, both symbolically and materially demonstrating that when trust fractures, so do the objects that mark tradition. Mothers sobbed behind hands, unspooling the quiet despair of women who had thought their world steady. Fathers paced like caged predators, anger a defensive armor covering their fear for what legacy and reputation might now cost their children. In the middle of it all, Bridget became a fulcrum, the one who had carried the news and now bore the blame for its delivery. Though she had only held a truth everyone deserved, she had imagined this moment as a hopeful release and found instead that truth often arrives as an accusation. Words of the most corrosive kind were used: cheat, conspiracy, betrayal, and with those words came the particular cruelty of people convinced of their moral high ground, sudden, deafening pronouncements about what would have to happen next, who would be cut out of family photos, who would be consulted about guardianship, whispers about the damage to reputations, the effect on trusts and companies, the economic consequences that in soap world are always only a heartbeat away from the personal. People remembered past lies and inflated them into proof. They dredged up transgressions that had long since been forgiven but were now being counted like debts owed. The courtroom air of calculation crept into the living room, and witnesses were mentally lined up and assessed for credibility by relatives who had never thought themselves judges. The moral arithmetic of daytime life, who deserved sympathy, who deserved condemnation, was being solved with too little evidence and too much passion, and the result was a kind of moral bloodletting. Amid the shouting and the paper-waving, more intimate fights bloomed, between lovers who had been steady and now found their intimacy invaded by doubt, between siblings who had drawn their identities against each other and now had to decide whether a shared history trumped current outrage, between parents and children as generational assumptions about honor and privacy collided spectacularly. Katie and Will, at the eye of the storm, had to conduct their own separate inner sieges, Katie oscillating between maternal instincts to protect and to punish, fearing not only the truth of paternity but the social condemnation that would follow. Will, whose identity felt abruptly malleable, alternately wanted to deny the evidence and demanded the cold certainty of tests, his voice cracking between bravado and vulnerability. These private fights were quieter but no less incendiary, the thorny, protracted arguments that follow when two people try to align their moral compasses after the ground has tilted. One wants to move forward and salvage marriage and family, the other wants to deconstruct and understand every assumption that led them here. Many nights passed in the following weeks with whispered, angry negotiations. Who would stay in the house, who would move out to prove a point, who would be allowed to see the child in question pending legal clarity, and each small decision was fought over as if it were the last crumb in a famine. Lawyers drafted temporary restraining orders and visitation agreements the way generals plan maneuvers, every clause a potential dagger, and those legal documents then became fodder for more fights when someone suggested that seeking court intervention was an admission of guilt or, conversely, an act of necessary caution. As the story widened into the public domain, the explosive fighting found new theaters. Tabloids delighted in framing the narrative as an epic of deception, late-night pundits dissected the morality of parenthood as if they were jurists, and social media, in its usual mercilessness, turned private pain into memes and hashtags that fluttered like obscene butterflies across the family's lives. The family's brand, business interests, philanthropic faces, charitable dinners, took a hit, and corporate meetings grew tense as board members whispered about the optics. Rivals saw opportunity and offered either sanctimonious condolences or calculated alliances, because in the world where glamour and scandal keep each other afloat, a family's rupture is always a marketplace. The legal drama that seemed inevitable came with its own brand of explosive fighting. Depositions that lasted for days became gladiatorial games where friends were made to choose whether to tell the truth as they remembered it or the version that would protect someone they loved. Forensic labs were subpoenaed and their technicians cross-examined, and a procedural tedium that would have been dull in another world became a theater of indignation and small, piercing victories as one side's witness was discredited and another's testimony suddenly shone with clarity. And yet, even as reputations were traded and calculations made, there were moments of a different intensity, raw, personal fights that made the larger public melodrama seem petty. There were scenes of lovers in the dark, hurling accusations and then sobbing into each other's shirts in a complex choreography of love and self-preservation. There were mothers who retreated to bathrooms to wail until their throats were hoarse and fathers who retreated to their cars to drive in circles until the night made sense again. There were friends who faced each other across kitchen tables and realized how little they really knew about one another's motives. Those smaller fights often cut deeper. They were where the real work, if any, would have to be done. People who could not reconcile flung themselves into new romances, seeking the balm of novelty, while others doubled down on old vows, not out of conviction but from fear of what life would mean without certain anchors. The child involved, even if too young to understand, was the silent subject of many arguments. Some insisted on shielding the baby from truth until some later date, others argued that withholding information was another kind of betrayal, and the ethical tangle here prompted some of the most heartfelt, most savage confrontations of all. Inevitably, the explosive fighting changed people. Reputations were mangled and sometimes rebuilt like kintsugi, gold filling the cracks of what had been shattered. Some relationships healed, scorched but stronger for the trial, while others dissolved entirely, the personalities behind them forced into exile or reinvention. The legal outcomes were messy and often unsatisfying: court orders that granted temporary custody to one parent and visitation to another, settlements that included confidentiality clauses as binding as vows, public apologies that were somewhat performative and yet, for some, genuine. The emotional fallout lasted longer than any headline. Holidays were awkward, family photos rearranged to reflect new alliances, and intimate rituals strained under the memory of the rupture. But in the quieter corners of the carnage were small acts of grace: the friend who sat with someone through a night of crying, the sibling who chose to stand up in court to tell an inconvenient truth, the cousin who finally admitted they had known something for months and chose to stop hiding. Those choices, small as they were, forged the slow work of repair. And so the scene that began with Bridget's revelation expanded into a saga of human complexity, explosive fighting that ranged from hissed accusations in corridors to public, televised depositions, from slaps and slammed doors to quiet, searing conversations that bent the arc of lives. In the end, what the fighting revealed, in all its ugliness and mercy, was that families are not monoliths of love or betrayal but messy ecosystems where loyalty, fear, pride, and love are constantly negotiated. The DNA result, objective, impersonal, had done what all great soap storylines do best: it peeled back the varnish of everyday life and exposed the raw wood beneath, forcing characters to answer who they were when stripped of the easy comforts of assumption. Some answered with forgiveness and reformation, some with bitterness and silence, and some simply kept going, changed in ways that would color every future decision. The explosive fighting did not end neatly. It reverberated, a series of small detonations over months and years, each one reshaping relationships, careers, and identities until the family, if not healed, was at least remade, bearing scars that were a map of lessons painfully learned and, occasionally, the foundations for a new, if wary, kind of trust. Lee's like, "Oops, my bad for hiding a killer while Luna's living rent-free in a mansion." Lee melts down, Luna plays her wicked games, Bridget drops a bomb, and everything is chaos. Luna's living large while Lee confesses she's an idiot. TLDR, the weekly B&B spoilers kick off with Will and Elektra pining for each other like texting doesn't exist. Finn gets blindsided by Luna's mansion living situation, Ridge drops bombshells on Taylor, Deke delivers unsolicited opinions to Hope, and everyone argues about whether Luna should be in prison or Bill's guest room while Bridget returns to alarm the resident psychopath. Monday melodrama, Will and Elektra pine separately like texting doesn't exist. Monday kicks off with Will and Elektra separately thinking about each other, which is soap opera code for they're going to stare wistfully out windows while sad music plays. Riveting stuff, truly. Can't wait to watch two people pine instead of just, texting each other. Meanwhile, B&B spoilers tease Finn gets caught off guard by Luna, which honestly tracks because apparently nobody told him the psycho who supposedly died is actually living at Bill Spencer's mansion rent-free. Classic Forrester family communication right there. Tuesday trauma, Ridge drops bombs while Deke delivers unsolicited opinions. Taylor is shocked by Ridge's news on Tuesday, and honestly, what else is new? Taylor being shocked by Ridge's life choices is basically her entire character at this point. The man has been making questionable decisions for decades, maybe developed some immunity to surprise? Deke makes a surprise visit to Hope to confess a supporting opinion, which is the most unnecessarily complicated way to say he showed up uninvited to give his 2 cents. Sir, did she ask? No? Then maybe keep your supporting opinion to yourself. Wednesday withholding, Luna explains why murderers deserve mansion living. Luna explains to Finn why she's living with Bill on Wednesday, and we're dying to know what possible explanation justifies a murderer getting the Spencer Mansion treatment instead of a jail cell. "Sorry I killed people, can I crash here?" is apparently an acceptable housing application in Los Angeles. Lee has an emotional meeting with Ridge to express the error of her ways, which is corporate speak for "I royally screwed up by helping a psychopath fake her death." "Yeah, Lee, you think?" Deke is concerned about how long he can withhold information from Hope, which raises the obvious question, why are you withholding information in the first place, Deke? This is bold and the beautiful, secrets always explode at the worst possible moment. Just tell her now and save yourself the inevitable dramatic reveal. Thursday Throwdown, adults debate prison versus poolside for Psycho Luna. Thursday's B&B spoilers bring the circus to town as Ridge, Bill, Taylor, Katie, and Finn argue about what should be done with Luna, house arrest or prison. Let's break this down. Luna is a literal murderer who faked her death, manipulated multiple people, and is currently freeloading at Bill's mansion. This should not be a debate. Prison. The answer is prison. Why is this even a discussion? The fact that house arrest is on the table shows exactly how broken the justice system is in soap opera land. Normal people go to jail for parking tickets, but Luna gets to choose between Bill's mansion or an actual cell? Make it make sense. Elektra and Ivy have a stirring conversation about Will and what to do moving forward, because apparently Elektra needs a committee meeting to decide whether to date the guy she clearly likes who's been pining for her. "Girl, just text him." This is not complicated. Friday finale, Will and Elektra actually interact plus Bridget alarms the criminal. Will and Elektra finally share a sweet moment on Friday, which presumably means they stopped thinking about each other separately and actually interacted like normal humans. Progress. Bridget arrives at Katie and Bill's, which alarms Luna. Good. Luna should be alarmed. She should be very alarmed. She's a murderer living in someone's house pretending everything's normal. The fact that more people arriving increases her anxiety is called consequences, sweetie. Get used to it. Taylor and Brooke actually agree on something, that Luna needs to be behind bars before Steffi learns she's alive. Finally, some common sense. When Taylor and Brooke are on the same page, you know the situation is serious. These two agree on approximately nothing, so the fact that they're united on put the murderer in prison should tell everyone something. Final thoughts for these B&B spoilers. The absurdity of Luna's living situation. Can we address the elephant in the mansion? Luna is a confirmed murderer who faked her death, and instead of being in custody, she's living at Bill Spencer's house while adults argue about whether she deserves house arrest or prison. The audacity. Bill letting Luna stay at his place is peak enabler behavior. Sir, your son was one of her victims. Why is she getting the guest room instead of a jail cell? This is not a halfway house for reformed villains, this is Bill Spencer's mansion, and Luna should not be there. The Will and Elektra saga nobody asked for. Will and Elektra spending the entire week thinking about each other separately before finally having a sweet moment on Friday is the most drawn-out romance in recent B&B history. These two like each other. Everyone knows they like each other. Just date already and stop making Ivy mediate your feelings through stirring conversations. The fact that Elektra needs to discuss with Ivy what to do moving forward about a guy she clearly wants to be with is exhausting. There's no strategy needed here. You like him. He likes you. Luna is a psycho. End of discussion.